The 6th Battalion of the Bedfordshire Regiment was designated a service battalion, meaning that it was raised specifically for the duration of the war. When the British Empire joined the Great War in August 1914, the British Secretary of State for War, Lord Herbert Kitchener, quickly realised that the war was likely to be long, and that the existing British army was not nearly large enough to fight a land war against the significantly larger Central Powers. In response, he started the process of raising a sequence of new armies from mid-August 1914, which are often referred to as Kitchener's Army or even Kitchener's Mob. The response to Kitchener's famous call to arms around Bedfordshire was both instant and enormous. The required 1,000 men needed to form a new battalion within the first new army, often referred to as K1, was easily surpassed within days of the call going out, with the newly formed 6th Battalion able to transfer 1,000 surplus recruits into the 7th Battalion, when the second new army was raised soon afterwards. From its formation, Lieutenant Colonel Bereford Cecil Molyneux Carter commanded the battalion, until Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Frederick Barclay took over between the 13th of November 1914 and the 22nd of August 1915, when he went on to command the 23rd Army Corps. Once the initial chaotic phases of enrolling the recruits and conducting medical inspections were completed, it was immediately clear that no uniforms or weapons were available to kit out the flood of new recruits. So the new recruits initially trained in their own clothes and concentrated on physical drill until weapons were issued months later. These new service battalions were organised around a nucleus of between 100 and 200 reservists who could train the recruits, given how overwhelmed the traditional pre-war training structures had become. Over the coming weeks, the new divisions were formed and spread out across the country, with the 6th Battalion moving to Aldershot. The battalion were originally assigned as divisional troops of the 9th Scottish Division, leaving in March 1915 when the 37th Infantry Division was formed. The 37th Division was comprised of the 110th Infantry Brigade until they were exchanged with the 63rd Infantry Brigade from the 21st Division in July 1916, the 111th Infantry Brigade, and the 112th Infantry Brigade, which was itself comprised of the 6th Battalion of the Bedfordshire Regiment, the 8th Battalion of the East Lancashire Regiment, the 10th Battalion of the Loyal North Lancashire Regiment, and the 11th Battalion of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. Initially based out of Andover and training around the Salisbury Plain, the division moved to Chalderton in April 1915. Early June 1915 saw specialist training ramped up and group photographs taken, all of which signalled that deployment overseas was closing in. I'm incredibly lucky to have been given the entire battalion's set of platoon photographs, which is unusual for such a group to have survived. See the link below to enjoy the full collection. On the 30th of July 1915, the division boarded trains, with the Bedfordshires marching to Ludgershall Station 7 miles northwest of Andover and disembarking at Southampton that afternoon. After boarding the troop ship the Empress Queen and an uneventful overnight crossing, they disembarked at Havre in northwest France at 7 a.m. the following day. The 37th Division concentrated around Saint-Omer and initially moved east into Belgium, but were transported to the northern sector of the Somme by trains late in August. From the 5th of September they were fed into the front line company by company and trained by the experienced regular army and territorial force battalions already holding the trenches, with the first casualties coming during the second day in the front line. During this period, Major Bertie Philip Newbolt assumed temporary command between the 22nd and 24th of August 1915, with Lieutenant Colonel Roundell Tristram Toke of the 1st Welsh Regiment taking over between the 24th of August 1915 and the 3rd of May 1916. The 6th Bedfordshires would spend their entire war on the Western Front, until being disbanded in a major reduction in the size of the British Army in May 1918, following their heavy losses during the German spring offensives. As with almost every new army unit, the battalion spent the first 10 months of their deployment purely holding the lines and occasionally being involved in trench raids, but were otherwise spared any major actions until July 1916. They were stationed in the Somme sector from August 1915, and on the 3rd of May 1916, Major, Acting Lieutenant Colonel Francis Hyde Edwards assumed command of the battalion, leading them throughout the Somme and Arras campaigns. During the opening days of the infamous Battle of the Somme 1916, the division was held in support and the Bedfordshires Brigade were attached to the 34th Division between the 7th of July and 21st of August, being engaged in the battles of the Somme 1916, specifically at the Battle of Bazentin Ridge on the 15th of July, where they lost 330 officers and men during their St Swithin's Day assault against the heavily fortified Poitiers village, the Battle of Poitiers Ridge from the 8th of August, and the Battle of the Ancre from the 15th of November. 1917 saw them engaged at the Battle of Arras in April, specifically at the First Battle of the Scarpe, the Second Battle of the Scarpe, and the Battle of Arleux, when just 58 men came out of their assault against Greenland Hill on the 29th of April 1917. Lieutenant Colonel William Robert Campion took over command between the 14th of May and the 26th of October 1917, whilst Lieutenant Colonel Edwards was on home leave in England. Later that year they were also engaged in the Battle of Ypres in 1917, which is also referred to as the Third Battle of Ypres or Passchendaele, namely during the Battle of the Menin Road on the 20th of September, the Battle of Polygon Wood on the 26th of September, the Battle of Bruciende on the 4th of October, and the Battle of Polkapelle on the 9th of October. After Lieutenant Colonel Edwards' lead was extended, Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey William Courtney took over command from the 26th of October until Colonel Edwards returned on the 22nd of December 1917. With the acute manpower shortage that had developed throughout the 1917 fighting, the British Army reorganised into a smaller army early in 1918, disbanding many of the junior service battalions and transferring their men into other units. As a result, the 112th Infantry Brigade became a 3-battalion brigade, comprised the 6th Battalion of the Bedfordshire Regiment, the 1st Battalion of the Essex Regiment, and the 13th Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers. When the German spring offensives burst onto the British lines in the Somme on the 21st of March 1918, the 37th Division were in the line around Ypres and were among those moved into the area to stem the German advance. They arrived on the front lines east of Gomicourt on April Fool's Day, where they would remain for what would be their final 7 weeks of service as a combat unit. 4 days later, the battalion were lightly engaged during the Battle of the Ypres within the first battles of the Somme 1918, losing around 30 men to shelling. They continued losing men almost daily to German shelling, until orders arrived on the 20th of May which saw the entire battalion, bar around 60 officers and ranks, transferred into the 1st Battalion of the Hertfordshire Regiment. After a farewell dinner that night, the battalion marched off almost 900 strong to effectively rebuild the 1st Hertfordshires, who had taken heavy losses during the spring offensives. The remaining 60 officers and men formed a training cadre which spent the summer training the newly arrived American troops, until in August 1918, when the cadre were disbanded administratively and the 6th Battalion of the Bedfordshire Regiment ceased to exist. Lieutenant Frederick William Hedges, known as Fred, Freddie or Bill, had joined the 6th Bedfordshires in September 1916, and after recovering from wounds received in April 1917, he returned to the front line in September 1918. As his battalion had been disbanded by then, he was attached to the 6th Battalion of the Northamptonshire Regiment at the end of September, and a month later would be awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions during the Battle of the Selle. Ironically, on the 4th of November 1918, he was wounded in the shoulder and the scalp during the Battle of the Somme. It is believed that the head wound, followed by his son's death during the Blitz in World War II, led to a troubled post-war life, and sadly Freddie took his own life on the 29th of May 1954. During the Great War, the 37th Division suffered some 30,000 casualties. Of these, the 6th Bedfordshires lost over 650 killed in action, with between 1,500 and 2,000 more of their number being wounded. Private 50119 Reginald George Bartram served in the 6th Battalion before being transferred to the Norfolk Regiment. He was the last of the Regimental Association's members who served in the Great War to have died. Born in Roxton in Bedfordshire on the 29th of May 1899, George died in September 1997, aged 98. Whether he is the last of the regiment's Great War veterans to have died or not is unconfirmed, but he is the last recorded one I've been able to identify so far.